The time has come, the walrus said, to talk of many things, of shoes and ships and sealing wax, of cabbages and kings. But he did not speak of childlessness, because that truth is too raw to be told. I think of the grief process as almost being grief by 1,000 cuts, in the sense that I think my grief first started the day that I realised that children weren't going to be conceived naturally and that it was going to be more difficult than I'd expected. And so there's a sadness that sets in at that point, but it's always ameliorated by this sense of hope of, well, you know, at some point I will conceive and have this child. When people ask me when did my childlessness journey begin, I think back to the women who came before me. My mother and my grandmothers were able to have children well into their 30s and one even in her early 40s. So naturally I assumed that I could do that as well. And so what they did was very much to open up opportunities for us. So what then happened for me was that during my childhood, I'd always, it was always at the back of my mind. Motherhood was always something that I wanted to do, but it was always into the future. It was certainly something that I would do one day. I found my partner in my early 30s, and by my mid-30s was when we started to try and conceive a child. It took us a couple of years until we realised that it just wasn't happening naturally, and at that time we were both really quite busy in our lives as well. What we did then is after a couple of years we went to our GP, and there wasn't any specific reason as to why conception wasn't happening. And we went straight into fertility treatment. So we went through insemination process and then also through IVF process. And we continued that. Basically it was a decade until I got to the point of realising, well, made the decision really to finish the journey. So you can feel this sense of anger and injustice, this incredible overwhelming sadness, this sense of shame that somehow you're not worthy or good enough, that something within you hasn't allowed it to happen. If I'm really honest, I actually had dreams where I couldn't imagine. I remember waking from many dreams in those early days. I just couldn't imagine going on. It was just like I could not imagine a life without children. It was like, it was almost like I couldn't imagine existing. And so it was about having to really reclaim my life back. Then what happened to me in terms of finishing the journey was that it was in conversation with a friend of mine, and she was so sweet because I hadn't really named it, and she sat with me and she said, she looked me in the eye and she said, "This isn't going to happen for you, is it?" And that was the moment at which I went, "You're right, it's not. It's not going to happen for me." And that was not long after my 46th birthday, so I was hopeful for a very long period of time. About 4 months after that, we made the decision to go overseas, and we walked the Camino de Santiago in Spain, and we walked 800 kilometres across Spain, and that was really a journey of healing and grief, and there was a lot of insights in that journey that were very much about, there were some rituals that I developed during that process. There were some things that I did in terms of letting go of the children, and really allowed me to find a place to put that grief, and really worked on some tools around nurturing myself through that process. We actually see grief as almost an aberration in our lives. It's like, it's this thing, this dark place that we go through, but what we need to do is just get through to the other side of it and all of a sudden get back on and, live that happy, joyful life, almost as if being happy and joyful is the normal life, and we have this period of time of darkness. Having said that, rather than grief being something that needs to be dealt with and contained, it's actually something that we need to be taught the skills of how to navigate grief and how to experience grief and be present to our own grief and our own emotions. So the first part is the telling of the story. The second part is holding the space for your own grief and your capacity to nurture yourself through the ongoing healing journey. The third is then looking at the grief work, and these are the skills needed to navigate the ongoing grief journey. So this is really about drilling down into what have been the losses for each individual woman, really having a look at how do you hold that space for your own feelings. But then it's also about what are the particular characteristics of your grief experience that have impacted on your journey. So it might be particular beliefs, particular thought patterns. It may particularly have manifested in your relationships. You might have particular relationships that are really tricky for you, that are really coming up in terms of your childlessness. The next part of it that's critically important then is actually also about finding your tribe. So connecting with other women who've been through the childlessness journey, who, you know, you can share stories, you can share that experience, and they can tell you, certainly the biggest part of it is actually to realise that what you're going through and your responses and your experiences are very normal, that they're a very normal response for a woman where being a mother has been really important to them. The final part of the journey, and this is the really interesting bit, is that who you become as a result of that journey and the future that you want to create for yourself, or that you're able to create for yourself. The big thing is about understanding who you become as a result of this journey, and then what it is that you would like to do with the time that remains to you, which might include strategies for building community, strategy for building meaningful relationships with children in your life, and how can you build, you know, those close connections and those close nurturing relationships with other children. And so I also work with women to develop some strategies around how do they build community, but how do they actually also reclaim those decades that they have in between. And the thing that's amazing about childless women is we've never had this number of women who are burning to be nurturers, who are so well educated and who have such a passion for creating change in this world. And one of the really key things, I'm getting a bit emotional about this, one of the really key things about the healing process is that once you can move from the small L life, which is about me and my family and my children, and you can shift that into the big L life, which is actually about humanity and the future of humanity, and what is it that we need as a human collective. Childless women have such an important role to play in the future of humanity and for the healing of the planet, healing of the earth, healing of our communities. That we have such an important role to play, and my burning passion is to support women to walk through that journey, through the fire, and rise and contribute.